Welcome to Midnight Casebook, where every shadow hides a secret and every mystery begs to be solved. Tonight, we unravel the chilling tale of Mystery Unraveled by Father Brown, a fan-made story paying homage to the brilliance of G.K. Chesterton's legendary detective. We'd love to have you along for this enigmatic journey. Drop a comment to let us know where you're watching from. Share your theories, and if you spot any inconsistencies, don't hesitate to call them out. Your keen eyes and sharp minds help us craft even more captivating mysteries in the future. Chapter 1. The clock struck twice. The moment the 13th chime rang through Kembleford's midnight air, something ancient stirred beneath the surface of the village's calm, like a breath held too long, finally being exhaled. At precisely 12 o'clock, the church clock should have fallen silent, but it didn't. It struck once, then again. Not a technical fault, not a malfunction. No, this was something deliberate, something impossible. And before dawn broke over the thatched rooftops and ivy-covered walls, Harold Grimshaw, the village's beloved clockmaker, would be found dead, slumped forward over his workbench, his eyes wide open in terror, his mouth half-formed around a scream he never had time to finish. By morning, the fairgrounds still echoed with the laughter of the night before, now hollow and chilling. The colored bunting twisted in the breeze like forgotten prayers, and the carousel horses, frozen mid-gallop, bore faces more manic than joyful under the rising light. When the constable finally forced the door open, he found the room locked from the inside and Grimshaw surrounded by perfectly working gears, all ticking in quiet mockery. The workbench was tidy, the tools aligned with the kind of obsessive care known only to craftsmen and the deeply disturbed. On the wall, the master clock ticked softly, except it was 6 minutes fast. It had never been fast, not once in 40 years. Everyone whispered it was an accident, a weak heart perhaps, overwork, old age. Mrs. Grimshaw, red-eyed and shaking, claimed he'd simply been tired. He was working late, she said, her voice brittle as sugar glass. He didn't even come to the fair. But Father Brown, standing quietly at the back of the workshop, said nothing. His eyes, calm and penetrating, took in the position of the body, the faint smudge of oil on the window latch, the disturbed carpet beneath the chair. None of it made sense, unless, of course, it made too much sense, unless the perfection of it all was the point. He stared at Grimshaw's hands, still curled slightly, as though reaching for something that had been there only moments before death. And there, almost hidden beneath the left palm, was a small brass key, not the kind used for winding, but longer, older, engraved, with what looked like a Roman numeral 13. Later, while the village returned to its gentle rhythm, bakers opening shutters, postmen whistling down lanes, Father Brown stood alone in the clock tower. Dust swirled in the narrow beams of light that filtered through the stained glass. He climbed the ladder slowly, step by step, and reached the mechanism that had governed the town's hours for generations. He examined the bells, the hammer, the notches. Everything appeared functional, except one new groove, barely perceptible, as though someone had filed it in. Just enough to add a second chime at midnight. Just enough to send a message. A message no one was supposed to hear. He descended quietly, not speaking a word of his discovery. In the distance, the townsfolk gathered outside the church, waiting for the noon bell to toll. As it struck 12 times with its usual solemn clarity, Father Brown watched the crowd. Most looked bored, others curious. Only one face stood out, a man at the back of the group, not looking at the bell tower, but at the workshop window. His coat was too fine for a villager. His shoes were city-made, untouched by mud. And when the 12th chime rang out, he turned to leave before the echo had even faded. Father Brown did not follow him. Not yet. There was something still buried, something unspoken. Grimshaw had left behind a silence, but not the peaceful kind. This was a silence that begged not to be broken, one forged in the final moments of a life not lost, but taken. Whatever the 13th chime meant, it had not been for show. It had been a warning, or perhaps a promise. And Father Brown, standing at the threshold of Grimshaw's lonely, locked world, could feel it already. The question was not who had killed the clockmaker. The question was why the clock had been made to lie. Chapter 2. The widow wore no black. They say grief is silent. But when the widow of a freshly murdered man is seen laughing the next morning with a stranger young enough to be her son, something more than silence begins to scream. The town of Kembleford had not yet finished whispering about the 13th chime of the church clock when the next shock rippled through its cobbled streets. Harold Grimshaw, the meticulous, soft-spoken clockmaker, had been found lifeless in his locked workshop, his eyes frozen in a look of pure dread. But it wasn't the locked door or the impossible timekeeping that unsettled Father Brown most. It was the woman who should have wept and didn't. Mrs. Eleanor Ainsley, Harold's widow, was seen at the tea shop the following morning. Her lips painted red, her cheeks freshly powdered, wearing blue satin and not a single trace of black. And not alone. She sat across from a man no one in the village recognized. Younger, handsome, too handsome. They shared private jokes and a pot of Darjeeling as if they were celebrating something, as if death were just a passing inconvenience. Father Brown, watching from the far corner of the tea room, felt a chill he couldn't attribute to the weather. He had seen grief expressed in many forms: tears, silence, even rage, but never laughter. He approached their table, his tone warm but probing. "Mrs. Ainsley," he said, "I'm deeply sorry for your loss." She rose, offered her hand with a brittle smile. "Thank you, Father." Harold lived a quiet life. Perhaps it's best he met a quiet end. The young man beside her said nothing, only offered a nod, but it was her hand that troubled Father Brown most, not for the rings, though there were more than before, but for its coldness. Cold, despite the warm day. Cold, like something had been drained from her. Not just warmth, not even grief. Something deeper, something hollow. That evening, word spread fast. Mrs. Ainsley had inherited everything: the workshop, the house, the bank account, and an insurance sum twice what Harold had declared. He must have updated his policy, she told the solicitor with a smile that never quite reached her eyes. But Father Brown had visited Harold only a week ago, and the man had confessed with a laugh that he hadn't changed a thing in years. "Not even me will." And then came the second whisper. The man. The stranger at the cafe. He wasn't a cousin, or an old friend, or even an out-of-town lawyer. No one knew his name, and he had vanished by the next morning, without booking a room, without anyone seeing him leave. By now, Father Brown's mind was no longer at peace. He wandered through the churchyard at dusk, thinking of Harold's workshop, of the unmarked brass key found in the old man's hand, of Eleanor's laughter, the kind that doesn't warm but chills. He returned to the workshop with a constable's reluctant permission. It had been sealed since the discovery of Harold's body. The air inside was thick with machine oil and something else, something acrid and unseen. The workbench remained undisturbed, except now the drawers had been emptied, all except one stuck shut. Father Brown knelt, tried gently to pry it loose, and with a quiet creak, it opened. Inside was a journal, not a business ledger, a personal diary. The entries grew more erratic the further back they went. Phrases like, "She stays out later now," and "the man in the blue coat" appeared repeatedly. Then, just 2 weeks before his death, "I've changed the will. She must never find it." But there was no new will on record, only the one that left Eleanor everything. Father Brown leaned back, heart heavy, mind racing. The man in the blue coat, the laughter, the 13th chime, all threads. But where did they meet? The next clue arrived not in the form of evidence, but of emotion. That Sunday, during Mass, Father Brown gave a sermon on honesty, on the thin veil between lies and truths we convince ourselves to believe. Halfway through, he noticed Eleanor in the back pew, eyes rimmed with red for the first time. But it wasn't sorrow, it was panic. She met his gaze only once, and in that second, Father Brown saw something he had only seen once before, on the face of a dying man in the confessional. It was the look of someone who knew their time was running out, not from grief, but from guilt. That evening, she came to him. Her dress was black this time, as if the costume finally caught up with the performance. "Father," she whispered, "there's something I need to confess." But she never did, because at that very moment, a brick crashed through the church window with a note tied to it. It read, "She knows who killed him," and she laughed. The handwriting was crude, uneven, male, likely, but not Harold's, not the constable's, not anyone local. And Eleanor, pale as frost, whispered, "I know that handwriting." But she wouldn't say whose. She simply turned and fled the church before Father Brown could stop her. The next morning, she was gone. So was the diary. And in her place, on the altar, was a small brass clock, a gift from Harold's collection. But it had no hands. It was just a face, frozen, mocking. The police were notified, of course. They searched her home, found everything neat, orderly, too neat, too orderly, as though she had cleaned away not only the dust and evidence, but the truth itself. And then came the first big reveal. Harold hadn't changed his will. The insurance policy was altered 6 days before his death. Signed, witnessed by the man in the blue coat, whose name was now listed as Thomas Welby, financial consultant, a man who, according to official records, had died in 1923. Father Brown stood over the paperwork in stunned silence. How could a dead man forge a will? Unless, of course, the man who showed up wasn't Thomas Welby, but someone who knew his name would raise no suspicion, someone who needed a signature, a date, and a witness no one would question, someone working with Eleanor, or perhaps controlling her. Was she the spider or the fly? Father Brown would not say, not yet. He returned to the church, where the broken glass had been swept, the altar set anew, and the brass clock, without hands, still sat in place. He stared into its empty face and whispered, "You're not telling time anymore. You're keeping secrets. Secrets that killed Harold Grimshaw. Secrets that laughed the next morning. Secrets dressed in blue and powdered faces and tea that tasted too sweet." That evening, as the sun bled down the village roofs and the clock tower struck 12 once more, Father Brown stood beneath it and said only this, "I know who did it, but the truth will never be told. Because sometimes knowing is not enough. Sometimes justice has no voice, And sometimes the widow never needed black, because she was never grieving at all. She was hiding, and now she's gone. But the 13th chime, it rang again, last night. And this time, it wasn't alone. Fade to black. Chapter 3. A confession without a crime. The confessional's wooden lattice had never concealed such terror as when Macready, the battle-hardened ex-soldier, stumbled in, reeking of whiskey and dread, whispering sins he dared not name. Father Brown had heard many confessions, but the palpable fear in Macready's voice that evening was unlike any other. The village of Kembleford knew Macready as a man haunted by his past, often finding solace at the bottom of a bottle. Yet, this was different. His fragmented words hinted at a darkness that transcended the horrors of war. "Forgive me, Father, for I have sinned," he began, his voice trembling. "The Lord is merciful," Father Brown replied gently. "What burdens your soul?" Macready hesitated, his breath ragged. I've done something terrible, something unforgivable, but I can't say it." Father Brown's brow furrowed with concern. "Unspoken sins fester, my son. To seek absolution, you must confront them." But Macready only shook his head, tears streaming down his weathered face. "I can't," he whispered, before abruptly fleeing the confessional, leaving Father Brown with a profound sense of unease. That night, a storm ravaged Kembleford, the howling wind mirroring the turmoil in Father Brown's heart. The following morning, the village awoke to unsettling news. Macready had vanished. His cottage stood eerily open, the door swaying in the wind. Inside, muddy footprints trailed across the floor, leading to a pair of boots caked in dirt. On the table lay a blood-stained dog collar, the name Buster engraved on its tarnished surface. Buster, Macready's loyal hound, was nowhere to be found. The villagers speculated wildly. Some whispered of foul play, others of Macready's possible desertion. But Father Brown sensed a deeper mystery, one intertwined with the soldier's tormented soul. Determined to uncover the truth, Father Brown retraced Macready's steps. He visited the local tavern, where the barkeep recalled Macready's final words. "Some things can't be undone." At the village market, a vendor mentioned seeing Macready arguing with a stranger days prior, a man with a scar above his left eye. Father Brown's investigation led him to the edge of the village, where dense woods concealed secrets of their own. There, he found traces of a struggle, broken branches, disturbed earth, and chillingly, a patch of dried blood. Nearby, hidden beneath foliage, lay Buster's lifeless body, the faithful dog's fur matted with blood. As Father Brown knelt beside the fallen hound, a profound sadness washed over him. He whispered a prayer for the innocent soul before rising with renewed resolve. The pieces of the puzzle were scattered, but a picture was beginning to form, one of guilt, fear, and an unspoken crime. Returning to the village, Father Brown sought out Sergeant Goodfellow, sharing his discoveries. The sergeant listened intently, his expression grave. Macready was a troubled man, he admitted. But to harm his own dog? It doesn't fit. Precisely, Father Brown agreed. Which means there's more to this than meets the eye. Together, they delved deeper into Macready's past, uncovering a history fraught with violence and regret. But amidst the darkness, a recurring name emerged. Lieutenant Harris, a comrade from the war, presumed dead. Rumors suggested Harris had survived, living under an alias to escape the ghosts of his past. Father Brown's mind raced. Could Harris be the scarred stranger seen with Macready? And if so, what unresolved business lay between them? The trail led them to a secluded cabin on the outskirts of the neighboring town. There they found Harris, alive but gravely wounded. He confessed to confronting Macready, seeking vengeance for a betrayal during the war. Their altercation had turned violent, resulting in Buster's death. Overcome with guilt and fearing retribution, Macready had fled into the night. Father Brown's heart ached for the broken men before him, both victims of a past they couldn't escape. He offered Harris absolution, urging him to seek medical attention and face the consequences of his actions. As for Macready, the search continued, but hope waned with each passing day. Weeks later, a body was discovered downstream, battered and unrecognizable. Clutched in its hand was a rosary, a symbol of a soul seeking redemption. Father Brown led the funeral service, praying that Macready had found the peace that eluded him in life. The village of Kembleford slowly returned to its routine, but the memory of Macready's confession lingered in Father Brown's mind, a haunting reminder of the burdens carried by those who have seen the horrors of war and the lengths to which guilt can drive a man. Chapter 4. A letter found too late. They found the letter wedged behind the church bell, sealed in dried blood, addressed to the bishop, dated the day before the victim died. The storm had rolled in just after sunset, when the handyman climbed the narrow wooden steps of the old bell tower to inspect a faulty rope. The place hadn't been touched in years. Dust lay thick on every surface, cobwebs dangled like veils, and the air smelled of rust and secrets. Then he saw it. Behind a splintered wooden beam, tucked into a crack in the stone, a folded piece of paper, brittle with age and stained with something far too dark to be ink, and on it one single word in urgent, shaky handwriting: deliver. But no one ever did, because the man who wrote it, John Archford, was already dead. They'd found him the previous morning, cold and stiff, at his desk in the rectory. No signs of struggle, no signs of poison, just a dead man, staring into nothing, a half-written sermon beside him, and a strange, faint smell of burned wax in the air. The authorities called it a heart attack. Case closed. A quiet man, a quiet death. Until the letter, addressed to the Bishop of Clanmire. Inside, a message that shattered the silence. They know what I did. I don't think I'll make it to morning. That one line changed everything. And yet, the signature at the bottom was unreadable, a blur of ink and water, as though it had been deliberately smudged. The handwriting matched John's journals exactly until the final two lines. Someone, it seemed, had taken his pen, or perhaps his hand had been forced. Father Brown didn't ask about the letter when he arrived. He didn't ask about the death either. He stood at the base of the bell tower, rain trickling down his coat, and asked only one thing: who had access to the tower, and why was it locked from the inside? The bell tower, everyone knew, had been sealed off for nearly 2 years. A cracked rung had made it unsafe. No one had gone up. No one had a key, or so they claimed. So how did the letter get there? And more importantly, why was it never sent? As Father Brown examined the wax seal, a strange expression crossed his face. It wasn't the bishop's crest. It was older, symbolic, and when he ran his finger across it, he whispered, "This has nothing to do with faith. This has everything to do with fear." The mystery deepened when he found a second letter buried in the church archives, hidden behind a false panel in an old drawer. Dust-covered, sealed, and eerily familiar. It had been written 5 years earlier, in the same handwriting. The same sentence closed it. They know what I did. I don't think I'll make it to morning. But that letter wasn't addressed to the bishop. It was addressed to MC. No clergy records matched those initials. No one in the parish recognized them. No one admitted to knowing anything at all. And yet, when Father Brown asked about the parishioners from 5 years ago, he was told something that made the air go cold. "No one's left said the clerk. "Every name on the old rolls is still here. No deaths, no departures, no transfers." Which left only 2 possibilities. Either a murder had gone unnoticed, or someone had lived here, been forgotten, erased, like a ghost in plain sight. John Archford's bank records showed something disturbing. Monthly payments. Same amount, same day each month. Always in cash. No recipient listed. But the payments began 1 week after the first letter was written. And they stopped the day he died. Was it blackmail, a payoff, or something more sinister? Father Brown wasn't certain, until he discovered the bishop's personal journal, hidden behind a loose brick in the vestry. In it, scattered among ordinary notes and appointments, was a brief, unsigned entry. The deal was made in silence. The bell will never ring again. He closed the journal slowly. "The truth," he said later, "is like a candle in a crypt. The moment you light it, everything starts to decay." But the deeper he dug, the more distorted the facts became. John Archford was not just a reclusive church caretaker. His past, as it turned out, was almost entirely undocumented before he arrived at the parish 8 years ago. No family, no known education, no trace of him in any diocese. But there was a story, a local one, a rumor, that years ago another man had served in this same church. A man who confessed something terrible and then vanished without explanation. No obituary, no resignation, just gone. And here's where things unravel completely. The confession box in the back chapel, sealed for over a decade, was found, recently unlocked. Inside was a scrap of paper, aged and barely legible. 7 words, scrawled in ink. "I buried it where no bell tolls." No one could explain it. No context, no date. But the phrase matched an old regional proverb, one that Father Brown remembered. "Where no bell tolls, no soul rests." Some began to whisper that Archford wasn't just hiding a secret, he was the secret. The church's foundation records, meticulously kept for centuries, had a curious gap during the exact year Archford arrived. A missing ledger, torn pages. The clerk claimed it was mold, but the damage was too precise, too deliberate. And then came the final blow. An old woman, nearly blind, approached Father Brown during evening prayers. She held a broken rosary and whispered, "He looked like him, but he didn't move like him. He didn't walk like a man carrying God." No one knew what she meant, but Father Brown did. He said nothing to the police, nothing to the bishop, just stood in the chapel, staring up at the bell, long since silent, and whispered, "I know who did it, but the truth will never be told." And somewhere, behind stone and shadow, the letter remains, folded, stained, waiting. And if you're wondering what John Archford was trying to confess, well, so is everyone else. But the real question isn't what he did. It's why the bishop never wanted the letter delivered, and who made sure it never would be. Or worse, what if the letter wasn't meant for the bishop at all? Chapter 5. The girl who watched everything. He had no face. That's what the girl drew. A man with no face standing outside the clockmaker's shop. And the next morning, the clockmaker was dead, and the girl was gone. Mary Tranter had never spoken a word in her life. Born mute, her voice had never echoed through the narrow streets of Kemble Row. But her silence didn't mean she didn't see. On the contrary, she saw everything. Always seated at her bedroom window, third floor, looking directly over the square, where the old clockmaker's shop sat like a crooked tooth in the mouth of the village. Locals called her the Watcher, affectionately at first, then more cautiously, because sometimes it felt like she saw more than she should. The clockmaker, Elijah Grice, was found early Tuesday morning, slumped over his workbench, a fine layer of dust still floating in the air above him. No blood, no wounds, no signs of a break-in. But every single clock in his shop, dozens of them, had stopped at 3:17 a.m. The coroner was baffled. The constable shrugged. A heart attack, they said, a stroke, perhaps a seizure in the night. The body was cold by dawn. And yet, something didn't feel right, because just before dawn, a drawing appeared on Mary Tranter's windowsill, one of her own, folded neatly, pinned beneath a stone, and on it a sketch of the square outside her window. The clockmaker's shop, drawn in precise detail, and standing beside it, a tall, black figure with no eyes, no mouth, no face, just blankness, emptiness, a silhouette of something that shouldn't exist. And then by afternoon, Mary was gone. She didn't leave a note. She couldn't. No packed bags, no sign of a struggle. Her coat remained on the hook. Her shoes still sat beneath her bed. The window was shut, the front door locked from the inside. Gone, as if plucked from the air. Father Brown arrived quietly. He asked no questions. He simply stood in Mary's room, staring out the window. The view was perfect. Directly onto the street below. The front of the clockmaker's shop visible as if drawn onto glass. He held the drawing in his hand. A man with no face, he said, almost to himself. Not someone she didn't recognize. Someone who wasn't supposed to be there at all. Then he looked down at the time on the church clock. It had stopped too. 3:17 a.m. And no one had noticed. That night, Father Brown returned to the shop. It hadn't been touched. The constable had sealed the door, but left the windows unlocked. Father Brown slipped in quietly. The clocks still hung lifeless. Silence sat like a weight in the air. And on the floor, beneath the counter, barely visible in the dust, was a single line etched into the wood. She saw me. Who wrote it? Why leave it there, where no one would find it, unless they knew where to look? Father Brown stayed in the shop until morning. When the sun rose, he stepped outside and stared up at Mary's window, and saw something impossible. The curtain had moved, but the room was empty. The constable had checked it 3 times. There was no attic, no cellar, no crawl space. And yet, the curtain had shifted, like someone was still watching, or trying to warn him. The townsfolk began to whisper. Mary's mother fell ill. The constable stopped sleeping. And someone, no one knew who, began nailing shut the doors of the church. Father Brown, for the first time in his career, said something he had never said before. I don't know what we're dealing with. Because Mary's drawings kept appearing, taped to the church doors, slipped under the postmaster's desk, pinned to the side of the butcher's cart, always folded, always unsigned, and always of the same thing. The man with no face, standing closer and closer to the church. By Friday, he was standing on the steps, and still, no one knew who he was, or what he wanted, or where Mary was. Father Brown returned to Mary's home and searched again. he found a box beneath her bed, filled with drawings. Hundreds, maybe thousands. Scenes from the village, from the square, from the clockmaker's shop. Some were charming, some were strange, but a few were terrifying. One showed the inside of a room that did not exist, a chamber of cracked walls and ticking clocks, and in the center, Mary sat in a wooden chair, her eyes wide, her mouth open, screaming. But she had never screamed in her life. Had she imagined it? Had she dreamed it? Or had she drawn something that was going to happen? Because the last drawing in the box was new, untouched by dust. A blank page, except for one line scrawled in shaky pencil. Midnight is not the end. It made no sense, until Father Brown went back to the shop one final time and found something even stranger. The clocks. Every clock in the shop had stopped at 3:17, but they were wound. Fully. They should have kept going. There was no mechanical reason for their silence, except for one. One small pocket watch, tucked into a drawer beneath the counter. It was still ticking, but not forward, backward, counting down. And the moment Father Brown picked it up, the hands jumped forward 5 seconds. He dropped it. The glass shattered, and behind the faceplate, etched into the metal, was a name. Mary Tranter. Why was her name inside a watch, owned by a man she had never spoken to? Why did every clock stop at the same time, except for one? And what was the man with no face? Father Brown looked at the shattered watch, then at the broken glass, and whispered, "This isn't about time, it's about what happens when time stops." He didn't sleep that night. The bells of the church didn't ring. And in the stillness, he heard something faint, something slow, like footsteps, dragging across cobblestones outside. When he looked out his window, the square was empty, but on his doorstep, folded neatly, was another drawing, the church, burning, and in the window, Mary, watching. They searched the belfry the next morning. It hadn't been opened in decades, but the dust had been disturbed, and on the bell itself, carved into the rusted metal, were 3 words, "I see you." No fingerprints, no signs of life, and still, Mary was gone, or hiding, or worse. That night, the bishop received a letter with no return address, no stamp. Inside was only a sketch of Father Brown standing beside a grave, his own, drawn in Mary's style, but dated next week. And the time on the grave, 3:17. Father Brown burned the letter. He said nothing to the bishop, only returned to the shop one final time, and in the ashes of the hearth, buried deep, he found it, a single charred photograph of Elijah Grice and Mary Tranter, standing side by side, smiling. She would have been 2, maybe 3. He was in his 30s. No one had ever said they knew each other. No one had ever mentioned a connection. And on the back, in faded ink, tick-tock, tick-tock. She knows when the silence stops. Father Brown sat alone that night, the photograph in his hand. Then he said, "I know who did it, but the truth will never be told. Because if it is, the clocks might start again, and this time they might not stop." Chapter 6. The garden where silence grows. They say roses don't bleed, but Father Brown found one in full bloom, its thorns slick with something that wasn't due, and buried beneath it, a pocket watch still ticking, next to a torn strip of priest's stole that wasn't his. It should have been just another still morning in the village of Kembleford. The air was thick with fog, the sun barely rising beyond the stained glass of St. Mary's. Birds were quiet, too quiet, and Father Brown, tired, contemplative, walking the overgrown path behind the vicarage, noticed something that stopped him cold. One of the rose bushes had been disturbed, its soil loose, petals scattered like they'd been torn off in a struggle. Something had been dug up or buried. He knelt beside it, brushed aside the earth with his bare hands, and found something glinting just below the surface. A shattered pocket watch, its glass cracked like a spider's web, but its hands still moving. And beside it, fabric. Not just any fabric. A torn piece of purple silk, embroidered with golden thread in a style no longer used. A fragment of a priest's stole, but not his. Father Brown's heart didn't race. It sank, because there hadn't been another priest in the parish for 10 years, and the last one, Father Adrian Roche, had disappeared without a trace. No body, no farewell, no scandal. Just gone. Until now. This was supposed to be holy ground. The garden behind the vicarage had once been a sanctuary, a place for quiet, prayer, for trimming herbs, for solitude. But it had long since grown wild, abandoned to vines and weeds, as if it too had forgotten something. Now it remembered. Father Brown brought the watch inside, placed it gently on his desk, and just stared at it. It was still ticking, but not in time. The hands moved forward, then back, then forward again. Tick, tock, tick, tock. He listened for a minute, then smashed it with a candlestick. It didn't break. No matter how hard he struck it, the glass wouldn't shatter. The hands just kept moving, and the sound grew louder, as if it was counting down. He buried it again, this time in the church cellar, beneath layers of brick and stone. But that night, he heard it ticking beneath the floorboards of his room. The next morning, he dug deeper into the garden, not out of hope, but out of dread. He removed the rosebush entirely. The roots were twisted, blackened, and deeper still, he found something else. Bone. Human. Old. Brittle. Not a full skeleton. Just a hand. And clutched in its fingers, almost deliberately placed, was a broken rosary. Beads snapped, the crucifix half melted, as if it had been in fire. Father Brown didn't report it. Not yet. Instead, he returned to the old vestry records. Dust-covered ledgers, ink faded to shadows. And there it was. Father Adrian Roche, assigned to Kembleford Parish in 1922. Final entry, 1934. No transfer, no retirement, no replacement form. Just a single line scrawled beside his name. Left in. Silence. But the handwriting didn't match the clerk's. In fact, it didn't match any known handwriting in the church's records. He looked closer. The ink was different, fresher, not from 1934, but newer. Someone had gone back and altered the records. Someone who knew the truth, or wanted it buried. He went to the bishop with the torn stole and the watch. The bishop examined them carefully, but said little. Then he whispered, "Adrian was never meant to stay. He saw something we shouldn't speak of." Father Brown leaned forward. What did he see? But the bishop only stood up, turned toward the stained glass window, and said, "Some things are planted in silence for a reason, because if they bloom, they choke." That night, Father Brown didn't sleep, because the ticking returned, louder, not from beneath the floorboards, but inside the walls, and when he awoke, there was dirt beneath his fingernails, but he hadn't left his bed. Or had he? The next day, the village changed. No one mentioned it, but the clock in the town square began running backward, and one by one, the flowers in the church garden began to wither, except for the roses above the bones. Those grew brighter, taller, blood red. Something was wrong, very wrong. Father Brown went to the village historian, Mrs. Levitt, who was 93 and nearly blind, but remembered everything. She hadn't spoken about Father Roach in decades, but when Brown mentioned the name, she went silent, then slowly said, "He was kind, too kind. He forgave everyone, even the ones who didn't deserve it." "What happened to him?" Father Brown asked. She smiled faintly. "He heard a confession from someone who never left the booth." "What do you mean?" "I mean, they never opened the door, never came out. But when he did, he wasn't the same. He locked the church, burned all the candles, prayed without stopping. Then, one day, he just walked into the garden and never came back. No one ever looked. No one ever asked. Until now." Father Brown returned to the garden again, dug deeper. He found part of a robe, black, decayed, buttons missing, and beneath it, another pocket watch, identical to the first, except this one had stopped. At 3:33 a.m., exactly the time he realized when the church bell rang last night, on its own, even though the bell tower was sealed. He returned to the tower, broke the lock, climbed. At the top, he found dust, cobwebs, silence, and a rope swinging, as if it had just been pulled. He touched it. It was warm. There was no breeze. Then he turned and saw it, carved into the stone wall behind the bell, barely visible under soot and moss. Adrian was right. He didn't go home that night. He slept in the pews and dreamed of roses growing over graves that had no names, of watches ticking beneath water, of confessions whispered through the cracks in the earth. And when he woke up, someone had left something on the altar, a third pocket watch. This one had no hands, only a single, etched phrase on the inside. "Time doesn't hide the truth. It buries it." He left it there. He didn't touch it, because he finally understood. Father Roche hadn't vanished. He'd been taken by something or someone he'd tried to warn them about. And now the garden was blooming again. But not with flowers, with secrets. Father Brown stood before the congregation that Sunday and said nothing about the garden, nothing about the bones, nothing about the watches. He only said, "Sometimes what grows in silence should stay there. Because if the truth ever came to light, if it were ever spoken aloud, it would spread. And not even the church could stop it. He knows who did it. But the truth will never be told." Chapter 7. The man who had no name. They arrested him at the railway station with blood on his coat, no ID, no memory, and the number 13 carved into his shoulder as if someone wanted him counted and forgotten. He didn't resist, didn't speak, didn't even blink. They said he walked off the 11:47 train without a ticket, stepped directly into the rain, and collapsed near the platform edge. When the constables pulled him upright, he stared at them with eyes that seemed to recognize everything and nothing all at once. The doctors called it amnesia. The inspectors called it a stunt. But Father Brown called it a warning. Because when they placed the man in a holding cell, stripped his coat and shirt to check for injuries, they found only one mark, tattooed on his left shoulder, burned into the skin like a brand, 13, Roman numerals, old ink, older intention. And when they finally got him to speak, hours later, after the light had faded from the sky and the station had emptied of sound, he said only one thing: "The truth dies at midnight." Then he stopped speaking altogether. He didn't eat, didn't sleep, just sat there, eyes locked on the far wall, lips sealed as if afraid of what else might come out. No one knew who he was. No prince, no name, no record in any national or international system. He had no wallet, no keys, no address, no past. It was like he had been born that morning. But someone, somewhere, knew him. Because that night, just past 11 p.m., a message was left in Father Brown's chapel, slipped between the pages of the Gospel of John, written in smudged ink, on thick vellum. Only 4 words: keep him alive, midnight. No signature, just that same Roman numeral again, 13, scratched into the bottom corner. Father Brown didn't hesitate. He left the chapel, crossed the dark, fog-draped village in silence, and walked into the jail, holding the page like it was a fuse. He asked to speak to the stranger. Alone. The constable hesitated, but something in Father Brown's eyes made him unlock the door. They stood face to face, one man in a priest's collar, the other wrapped in silence, his bare shoulders showing that terrible mark. "Do you know me?" Father Brown asked softly. The man didn't answer. "Do you remember anything?" And then, so faintly it might have been imagined, he said, "I remember a bell that didn't ring, but screamed." Then silence again. But that was enough, because only one place in the county had a bell tower with no bell, and that place had been sealed for over 20 years after the fire, a fire that killed 12 unnamed, 12 unburied, 12 unsolved, until now, 13, the missing 13th victim, or the cause, or the witness. Father Brown left the station and returned to the archives. He pulled the sealed folder from the restricted cabinet. It was labeled St. Hallows, 1933. Fire. Do not open. But he opened it. Inside, only ashes, photos scorched, names blacked out, pages crumbled into dust, except for one, a ledger, listing the clergy assigned to the church at the time of the fire. 12 names, one line scratched out, and beside it, faintly written, Initiate 13, not a priest, not a deacon, an initiate, a candidate for holy orders, unrecorded, unrecognized, unofficial, invisible, but not forgotten, because someone burned the records and someone kept the mark. When Father Brown returned to the jail, the stranger was gone. The door was still locked. The guards hadn't slept, but the cell was empty, and in his place, on the wooden bench, was a single object, a priest's collar, blood-stained, torn. Father Brown touched it, still warm. And then the church bells rang, midnight, but not 12 chimes, 13. 13 bells for a man who had no name and no past, but who had come back for the truth. Except now, the truth was trying to run. The next morning, the bishop denied everything. There was no Initiate 13, he said, eyes steady. But when Father Brown placed the vellum note on his desk, the bishop's hand trembled. "Where did you get this?" "In the chapel," Father Brown replied. "Last night, before midnight, the bishop stood, turned toward the crucifix, then said something that made the room feel smaller. If he's here, it's already too late." "Why?" Father Brown asked, but the bishop just whispered, "Because he wasn't meant to survive the fire." That night, the train whistle blew at 11:47 p.m. The same train, the same track, but no passengers disembarked. Only a priest's stole, folded neatly on the bench where the man had first appeared. Father Brown picked it up. Inside, stitched in thread so faint it could barely be seen, was a phrase in Latin, Veritas perit ad medium noctem. The truth dies at midnight. He took it home, placed it on the altar, and stared at it until dawn. But the questions screamed inside his skull. What truth? What had 13 known? What had he seen? And why had he come back? Because the next morning, something else happened. A confession, delivered by post, no return address, typed, clean, precise, a full account, the fire, the ritual, the vote, the choice. 12 men voted to burn the 13th, a scapegoat, an offering, for silence, for secrecy, for something they feared more than sin. Father Brown read it once, then again, and when he was done, he lit a match, set the paper aflame, watched the ashes scatter. He told no one, only said, "I know who did it, but the truth will never be told, because some truths are carved too deep. Some names were never meant to be remembered, and some men were never meant to come back." Chapter 8. The trap set in silence. At exactly midnight, beneath the flickering light of the church's last candle, one of the villagers screamed, not because they were attacked, but because they realized Father Brown had known their secret all along. It started with an invitation. Nothing dramatic, nothing grand, just a soft notice on the church door. A few handwritten letters tucked into mail slots, a quiet word whispered during Sunday tea. Midnight vigil, for peace, for the truth, but Father Brown wasn't calling for prayer. He was calling for a killer, because behind his round spectacles and calm voice, Father Brown had pieced together something too disturbing to speak aloud, a pattern no one else could see, not even the police, not even the killer themselves. He'd watched the village change over the past weeks. Subtle things. The way Mrs. Talbot locked her bakery early and refused to speak after sunset. The sudden silence in the local pub when someone mentioned the garden behind the vicarage. The sharp look in the blacksmith's eye when asked about the clockmaker's broken watch. And then, there was the child, young Mary Tranter, still missing. And the stranger with no name. Gone. The pocket watches, the torn stoles, the unburied bones beneath blooming roses. It was all connected, but no one would confess. So Father Brown set a trap. One made not of force, but of silence. A silence so deep it would press down on their skin, crawl into their lungs, and make even the most buried guilt rise to the surface. He chose midnight for a reason. That's when the village felt wrong. The hour the clocks stopped ticking. The hour the train passed, but never arrived. The hour where light bent strangely through stained glass, and shadows moved like they were remembering things you'd rather forget. He lit the candles one by one, each with its own meaning. 12. For the victims, for the secrets, for the lies. Each villager entered slowly, eyes darting, pretending this was just another odd request from the priest. But no one truly believed that. Not this time. They sat in the pews. The air grew colder. No hymns were sung, no prayers were read. Only the silence and the creak of old wood kept them company. Until Father Brown stood at the altar and whispered, "One of you has forgotten what guilt feels like. So I've left reminders." No one moved. No one breathed. He walked slowly down the aisle, candle in hand, and stopped beside Mr. Dalrymple, the tailor who hadn't stitched a robe in weeks. "I found a button behind the vestry, hand-carved, ivory, rare, the kind only one man in this village ever used." Dalrymple's lips parted, but he said nothing. Father Brown moved on. In the bakery cellar, there's a ledger, pages torn out, recipes rewritten. But the original ink is still visible if you know how to look." Mrs. Talbot's hands clenched on her lap. He walked behind the pews now, his voice still soft. "And in the garden, something is still growing." That's when the ticking began, not from the wall, not from a clock, but from inside the church. A low, rhythmic sound, metallic, unnatural. Everyone heard it. No one saw where it came from. Father Brown didn't react. He only lit the 13th candle and placed it on the floor, in front of the altar. This candle is for the one who thought silence would last forever. And suddenly, someone stood up, a man in the back, face pale, eyes wide. "You can't do this," he muttered. Everyone turned, but Father Brown didn't. He only said, "Why not? Because it's midnight? Because the truth dies now?" The man stepped back, tripped, fell against the pew, and the ticking stopped. Dead silence. Then the church bell rang. Once, twice, 13 times. No one had touched the rope, but every villager in the room felt it. The sound wasn't from above. It was from within, as if the church itself was remembering. The man who stood had vanished. No one saw him leave, but in his place, on the pew, was a folded letter. Father Brown opened it, and inside, names, 13, one for each secret, each victim, each lie, written in a hand Father Brown had never seen before, except once, on the inside of a pocket watch. He folded the letter, slipped it into his coat, said nothing, because he didn't need to. The trap had worked, and the killer had revealed himself, not with violence, but with fear. Fear of what Father Brown might say next, fear of what else he knew. But Father Brown didn't accuse, didn't confront. He simply said, "Thank you all for coming. The truth is a heavy thing. I suggest we all carry it together." One by one, the villagers left. No one spoke, no one made eye contact, and no one heard the ticking again, until the next night, when another folded letter appeared, pinned to the chapel door. No words, only a drawing of Father Brown, standing at his own grave, and the time on the stone, midnight. He took the letter, burned it, then said softly, "I know who did it, but the truth will never be told, because the trap wasn't just for the killer, it was for everyone else, to remind them silence can only hold so long before it breaks." Chapter 9. The Secret That Broke the Village. The day before she vanished, mute little Mary Tranter drew a picture of Mrs. Ainsley and Mr. Macready, standing over the clockmaker's dead body, holding hands. She couldn't speak, but that drawing screamed. No one believed it at first. Why would they? Mrs. Ainsley was the village's moral spine, a widow who hosted charity teas, ran the chapel choir, and never missed a Sunday service. And Macready, the war hero, decorated, quiet, lived alone in the cottage by the woods, spent his days fixing broken radios and building clocks he never sold. Two people no one suspected. Two people everyone trusted. And yet, there they were, drawn in Mary's shaky, deliberate lines. Not just near the scene, inside it. Standing beside Elijah Grice, the clockmaker, his body crumpled, his watch smashed. One detail changed everything. In the corner of the drawing, scrawled in a red crayon Mary had never used before, was a number. 1944. A year. A secret. A death that didn't belong to the village, but somehow ruled it. No one wanted to believe it. But Father Brown already did, because this wasn't just a murder, it was a cover-up, and Mary had seen everything. The trouble started 2 weeks earlier. Father Brown had found the broken watch in the garden. The clocks had stopped. Whispers echoed in the chapel, though no one spoke, and Mary, sweet, silent Mary, had vanished from her room without opening a single door. People feared the strange, the supernatural. But Father Brown feared something worse, the human heart. And now, after months of digging, carefully, quietly, he had names, not one, but two, bound together not by blood or religion or duty, but by betrayal, the kind that starts wars, the kind that never ends. It began during the final winter of the war, 1944. The village was silent, starved of men. Only Macready had returned from the front, early and shaken, discharged for reasons no one questioned. Mrs. Ainsley was already a widow by then, or so, she claimed. They were seen walking together in the evenings, talking too closely, laughing too softly, but no one dared to speak ill. Not then, not after what they'd both lost, except Elijah Grice. The clockmaker didn't smile much, but he watched. He watched everything. And one night, just weeks before his death, he'd gone to Father Brown with a single sentence: "Time's not the only thing I've been keeping." Then he left. Didn't say more, didn't need to. Because when Father Brown entered Grice's shop after the murder, the first thing he saw wasn't the body. It was the safe, half open, empty. Whatever Grice had been keeping was gone. But what if Mary saw it? What if she saw who took it? Her room overlooked the square. She was always watching. Everyone knew that, but no one thought she could understand. They were wrong. She had drawn the man with no face. She had drawn the rose garden, and now she had drawn the killers. But it wasn't just about the clockmaker. It went deeper, because buried inside the church records, hidden in a hymnal dating back to the war, Father Brown found something else. A list. Faded. Burnt around the edges. It listed the names of evacuees sent from London to Campbellford during the Blitz. 27 children. All accounted for, except one. Name blacked out. Next to it, scribbled in faint pencil, "Returned to sender. M.A. M.A. Macready. Ainsley." The initials weren't a coincidence. It wasn't just an affair. It was a disappearance. A child, vanished under their care. And Grice knew. He had records, old shipping tags, wartime correspondence. One letter never sent, addressed to the Office of Refugee Placement, signed E. Grice. Father Brown found it in the base of an old grandfather clock, dismantled and stuffed behind the gears. It read, "They say the girl was sent back, but the dates don't match. The train never came. And I saw the boy, Macready, digging." That letter was never mailed, but it was enough. Enough to shatter the mask they'd worn for 30 years. Mrs. Ainsley, with her pearls and perfect hair, had lied. Macready, with his medals and his silence, had buried something, or someone. And now, Elijah Grice was dead. Mary was missing. And the garden behind the vicarage had begun to bloom in unnatural ways. Red roses growing in frost. Father Brown gathered the villagers at dusk. He didn't say why, just that they should come. When they did, he led them, wordlessly, to the garden, and began to dig. One by one, the roses came up, roots tangled, thorns deep, until his spade struck wood. Small, child-sized, a box. Everyone stepped back. Mrs. Ainsley turned white. Macready didn't move. The box wasn't opened. Not that night, but something had already been revealed. Father Brown looked at Macready, then at Mrs. Ainsley, and said, "The sins of the past don't stay buried, especially not here." That night, Macready vanished. 2 days later, Ainsley collapsed during choir practice. A stroke, they said, but her final words were heard by only one person. She knew, she saw us. The little girl, Mary. They'd planned to silence her next, but Mary was already gone. Or maybe she was still watching, because days later, in the chapel, Father Brown found one final drawing, folded, placed inside the Bible on the altar. The same crayon strokes, the same strange clarity. It showed two figures, a man and a woman, holding hands, sinking into the soil. Below them, a clock. Its hands stopped at 11:59, and beneath it, in red, 1 minute left. He looked up. No one else was in the chapel, only the sound of the wind outside. And yet, it felt like someone had just left, or never left at all. He held the drawing, folded it carefully, placed it in his coat pocket, and whispered, "I know who did it, but the truth will never be told." Because the truth had broken the village, and it wasn't done yet. Chapter 10. What the Dead Leave Behind. The girl was buried alive beneath the chapel floor, and she was still breathing when Father Brown found her. You read that right. When the searchers gave up, when the village had gone quiet, and even the church bells stopped ringing. That's when Father Brown heard something else. Not prayer, not voices, scratching. It came from beneath the altar, beneath the stone, where no one was ever meant to look, where someone, two someones, had buried Mary Tranter alive. The mute girl who had watched everything. She had drawn the faces of murderers. She had known the secret that broke the village. And when she vanished, everyone feared the worst. Everyone except Father Brown, because he believed in silence. He understood how it waits, how it hides, and how sometimes silence screams louder than sound. He knelt before the altar, pressed his ear to the floor, and he knew. Beneath the stone, buried beneath the very house of God, a child was trying to scratch her way back to the light. And the people who had put her there, they were sitting in the pews. Mrs. Ainsley, Macready, lovers, traitors, killers. Their wartime secret had already claimed the clockmaker's life. It had already driven the village into shadow. But still, it wasn't enough. Mary had seen too much. She had drawn too much. She had understood far more than they expected from a silent child. So they had to silence her for good. But they underestimated the dead, and what the dead leave behind. Because Mary had left something, not a scream, not a cry, but a drawing, tucked in her bed hours before her disappearance, folded under the pillow. A drawing of the church floor, the altar, a shadow of a girl beneath it, and two dark figures above. It was the map to her grave, and Father Brown followed it. He pried the stone loose with his bare hands, tore his fingers raw, pulled up the wood, pulled back the earth, and found her, unconscious, but breathing, still alive. The moment her hand gripped his wrist, the clock above the altar struck once, then twice, and then nothing. Because some clocks are haunted by guilt, and some time never really passes. Mary was saved. She was carried out in silence, wrapped in Father Brown's coat. Her pulse weak, her eyes fluttering, her hand still clutching something in her fist. A button, pearl, unique, from Mrs. Ainsley's coat. There was no trial, there didn't need to be. Because when Macready was taken by the constables, he never said a word. He only looked at Father Brown once and whispered, "She wasn't supposed to remember." And Mrs. Ainsley, she didn't cry. She didn't speak. She just stared at the church's broken door as they led her away, eyes wide, as if seeing something no one else could. Something waiting. In the garden. in the bells, in the place where silence lives. The village came back to life, slowly, like a body coming out of deep sleep. Shops reopened, candles were lit. The choir sang again. But no one truly felt whole, because something had cracked beneath the surface, and the truth, once seen, can't be unseen. Not when the flowers bloom red in the frost, not when the clocks tick backward, not when a girl who's never spoken starts drawing nightmares that come true. Father Brown gave his sermon the following Sunday. The church was packed, not because people needed God, but because they needed sense, and he gave them none. He didn't mention the murders, didn't name the guilty, didn't curse the sin. Instead, he said this: "It is not enough to punish evil. We must understand why it hides so well among us." The villagers listened. Not all understood, but all remembered, and some wept, because they knew. They had seen something in their neighbors, in themselves, in the mirror of this terrible story. They had seen what they were capable of. After the service, Mary sat beside Father Brown in the garden. She hadn't spoken, not once, but she smiled, and then pointed up, to the belfry, where the church clock stood still, no sound, no ticking, until chime, once, then again. 2 soft bells, too quiet for the mechanism, too slow for the gears. Father Brown looked up. A bird fluttered in the tower, just a bird. Or was it? He tilted his head, smiled, then stood. He walked down the path as the village breathed behind him, walked past the graves, past the old bell rope, and whispered, "I know who did it, but the truth will never be told." Because the truth didn't belong to him. Not anymore. It belonged to the silence, and what the dead leave behind